Imagine for a second that you are drowning,
Oh, okay.
but you're not in the ocean. You are lying in your own bed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It is December 1799. Outside, a freezing Virginia rain is basically turning the whole world to ice.
Right.
But inside, you are suffocating in slow motion.
Right.
Your throat is swelling shut. It's acting like a one-way valve that just traps air out. Every desperate breath you try to pull in just seals that valve tighter.
It's terrifying to even picture.
It is. And standing around your bed are the best doctors in the country, the men you trust most. But instead of saving you, they are systematically draining your blood.
Yeah, that was the standard of care.
Right. They take a pint, then another,
Ugh.
then another, until 5 pints. I mean, that's more than half the blood in your entire body are just gone.
So your heart is racing, desperately trying to pump oxygen to a brain that's suffocating.
Exactly. But your lungs physically cannot take the air in.
Wow.
And now your veins are literally running dry. You're
Yeah.
completely aware that you're being bled and dehydrated to death while suffocating.
Yeah.
And yet, you don't panic.
Yep.
You look up at the doctors and you tell them to stop. You just say, I die hard, but I'm not afraid to go.
It is a profoundly grim way to spend your final hours. I mean, almost unimaginable.
Yeah.
And the level of pure stoic control it takes to endure that without breaking, that tells you almost everything you need to know about the psychology of the man in that bed.
Right. Because usually when we look at the marble monument of this man, there's none of that agony.
None at all.
There's just this expectation of permanence, like engineering.
Yeah.
See this strong jaw, the perfect posture, and the plaque on the stone just points and says, there is the hero.
It's solid. It's clean.
Hero or not hero. But welcome to today's deep dive. Today is Saturday, March 14th, 2026, and our mission today is to completely strip away that marble monument.
Yes. Let's get to the actual human being.
Exactly. We are exploring the human being underneath George Washington, and we are using a towering stack of sources today.
We've got detailed military analyses, intimate biographies, and his own raw, unedited letters.
Right, and we're going to trace his life from birth to death. But I want to set a very specific tone for you right off the bat. If you're looking for a triumphant, glossy myth today, this isn't it.
No, we are looking at a heavy, often dark story.
A deeply somber story. Because the reality of the 18th century was totally unforgiving.
It was brutal.
It really was. This is the story of a man who built himself from scratch out of sheer anxiety and ambition. A man who bore the crushing weight of a fragile new nation and who wrestled with profound, unsolvable moral contradictions.
Right.
I want you, the listener, to imagine the sheer terror and pressure of holding a starving army together in the freezing mud, or inventing a presidency from absolutely nothing.
Knowing that every single misstep could doom millions of people to tyranny.
Or anarchy. So, okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the early years. He was born February 22nd, 1732 at Bobes Creek, Virginia.
Right.
But the defining characteristic of his childhood wasn't privilege. It was sudden catastrophic loss.
Yes, I mean, the family was part of the landed gentry, sure, but they moved frequently. When he was 3, they went to an estate on Little Hunting Creek.
Which would later become Mount Vernon, right?
Exactly. Then they moved to Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg. But the shattering moment of his youth was the sudden death of his father, Augustine, in 1743.
George was only 11 years old.
Yeah. And what's fascinating here is how this single event completely derailed the trajectory of his life. It mechanically altered his entire future.
Because he was a younger son, right, from second marriage. He had older half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine.
Right. And back then, inheritance and opportunity just weren't doled out equally.
Not at all.
Those older half-brothers had received a classical liberal education at the Appleby School in England. That was the gold standard.
Like the Ivy League of the colonial era.
Basically, yeah. It was the expectation for a Virginia gentleman of that standing. You go to England, you learn Latin, you learn Greek, classical philosophy, and you return as a fully minted aristocrat ready to govern.
But with his father's death, the funds simply weren't there for George.
The wealth was tied up in land and slaves, and the cash flow just stopped.
Right.
So he inherited Ferry Farm and 10 enslaved people. That plants him in the landed gentry, but nowhere near the top of the social hierarchy.
He was explicitly denied that English education. And from what I read, it really haunted him.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like watching your older siblings get handed full rides to Harvard and Yale, and then the money runs out and you're handed a rusty shovel and told to figure it out.
That's a great way to put it.
And you can see that insecurity in his own writing. He actually wrote later, as an adult, that Future years cannot compensate for lost days at this period of a person's life.
He always felt intellectually inferior to the guys who went to college, the Jeffersons, the Adamses, the Hamiltons.
Yeah, so he's thrust into a position where he has to be a self-made man out of pure necessity.
He's attending the lower church school, but he isn't learning philosophy. He's learning highly practical, mechanical skills.
Like math and geometry.
Exactly, surveying. He's learning the law as it applies to land, how to write leases, bonds, patents. He's learning the bare-knuckle economics of the Virginia frontier.
And he's so desperate to improve himself, to somehow fake the polish of an English boarding school, that he's basically mining books for maxims to live by.
Right.
This is where we get the famous story of him copying out all 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation as a teenager.
Which is such a revealing detail. He copied them from an English translation of a 16th century French Jesuit guidebook.
It wasn't an assignment for school or something.
No, not at all. It was a survival mechanism. It shows this immense, almost anxious discipline. He is quite literally constructing the persona of George Washington.
Yeah.
He's trying to figure out how to navigate the upper echelons of society, how to stand, how to eat, how to speak to superiors without the formal pedigree to back it up.
And he gets a massive life-changing lifeline through his older half-brother, Lawrence, right? Whom he essentially worshipped.
He did. And Lawrence marries Anne Fairfax.
And the Fairfaxes aren't just rich. They are like European nobility living in America.
They are enormously powerful. Colonel William Fairfax controlled millions of acres of Virginia land.
Millions. That's absurd.
Right. So when Lawrence marries Anne, he is elevated into this highest social class. He wins a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses. And crucially, he brings his young, awkward half-brother George into the fold at the Fairfax estate, Belvoir.
So George suddenly has access to one of the greatest libraries in the colony.
Exactly. He learns to navigate polite society, he goes on fox hunts, and he was a notoriously brilliant horseback rider, by the way. Incredible balance and physical strength.
Yeah, but he still needs a job. He can't just hang out at the estate forever.
Right. And through this Fairfax connection, at just 16 years old, he heads out to the Shenandoah Valley to survey the massive Fairfax land grants.
And surveying back then wasn't just looking through a little lens on a tripod.
No, it was brutal physical labor. You are dragging heavy metal chains, Gunter's chains they called them, exactly 66 feet long.
Through dense, unbroken wilderness.
Over mountains, across freezing rivers. You are dealing with exposure, the threat of attack, wild animals, and terrible food.
And sleeping on the ground in clothes that never dry.
Exactly.
So I have a question here. It seems like his whole youth was defined by trauma and missed opportunities. How did a teenager process being thrust into that harsh wilderness instead of a posh English boarding school? Because surveying the frontier in 1748 isn't a glamorous internship. It's a survival test.
It was a crucible, absolutely. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, this rugged survivalism in the Shenandoah didn't just build his physical endurance.
Yeah.
It built his stoic character. It prepared him for the grim, unforgiving reality of the frontier. He wasn't just measuring dirt. He was learning the topography of a continent.
Which comes in real handy later.
Very much so.
Yeah.
He accumulated about 2,500 acres of his own land there by the time he was 21, because surveyors were often paid in land.
Oh, clever.
Yeah. But more importantly, he was learning the literal lay of the land, understanding mountain passes and river fords. That would become vital military intelligence later.
And he was learning how men behave when they are cold, hungry, and exhausted.
Exactly.
But right before this frontier immersion completely takes over his life, we have to talk about his only trip abroad. The 1751 trip to Barbados with Lawrence.
Yes, because Lawrence was suffering from tuberculosis.
Which was a death sentence at the time.
It was. But the prevailing medical theory was that the warm, tropical climate of the Caribbean could cure the lungs. So, 19-year-old George accompanies his brother.
And it didn't work?
No, it was a failure. Lawrence died the next year anyway. But for George, that trip was catastrophic. And ironically, it might have changed the course of world history.
How so?
While in Barbados, George contracted smallpox.
And smallpox in the 18th century was a monster. It wasn't just a bad fever. It was an agonizing, highly lethal disease that covered your body inside and out with fluid-filled pustules.
It was incredibly deadly, wiping out massive percentages of populations. Washington survived it, which gave him a lifelong immunity.
And we'll see how crucial that was when smallpox later ravaged his Continental Army, and he could walk among the sick without fear.
Right. But it left him with permanent, deep facial scars. And if you look the medical histories detailed in the biographies, the high fever and systemic infection of this specific bout of smallpox is very likely what rendered him sterile for the rest of his life.
Wow. It's just wave after wave of physical and emotional trauma. First his father, then he almost dies of a horrific disease, and then his beloved brother Lawrence dies in 1752.
Right, which leaves a massive vacancy. Lawrence held a position in the Virginia militia.
And George, who is now 20 years old and has zero actual military experience, decides he wants that spot.
He does. He leverages his Fairfax connections to take Lawrence's place as a district adjutant. He becomes a major in the Virginia militia.
I mean, he looked the part perfectly, right?
He really did. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall in an era when the average man was 5'7". He weighed about 180 pounds, broad-shouldered, muscular from all that surveying.
But he was entirely green. He'd never heard a shot fired in anger.
And the geopolitical world was about to throw this inexperienced kid into the deep end.
Yeah. The British Empire and the French Empire were aggressively competing for control of the Ohio River Valley.
It was the gateway to the interior of the continent. By late 1753, the Virginia Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, needs to send a message to the French forces essentially saying, "Get out of our territory."
So he sends the 21-year-old Washington into the freezing, miserable Ohio wilderness in the dead of winter to deliver it.
Which is insane.
It is. And Washington somehow survives that journey. He falls off a raft into an ice-choked river, gets shot at by a guide.
He comes back, delivers the French refusal, and writes a report that gets published in London. It actually makes him mildly famous.
So in 1754, Dinwiddie promotes him to lieutenant colonel and sends him back with a small force of about 300 men to actually confront the French.
Washington learns the French are building Fort Duquesne, right where modern-day Pittsburgh is.
So he sets up a defensive position at a place called Great Meadows. And he gets intelligence from his Native American allies that a small French detachment is nearby.
Right.
So on the morning of May 28, 1754, a 22-year-old George Washington marches through the dark woods and commands an ambush.
The Battle of Jumonville Glen.
And this ambush doesn't just stay in the woods. By doing what he does here, Washington practically hands the French a casus belli on a silver platter.
He really does. It is a dark, tragic, and chaotic sequence of events.
What actually happened?
Well, Washington's force, alongside their Iroquois allies, led by a chief named Kit Carson, surrounds the sleeping French camp. Someone fires a shot, history still debates who, and a brief, bloody skirmish ensues.
And the French commander is wounded?
Yes. Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. Now, the French insist Jumonville was carrying a diplomatic message. They said he was an envoy, protected by the rules of war.
But Washington claims they were spies preparing to ambush him.
Exactly. But while Washington is trying to interrogate the wounded Jumonville, Tennyson steps forward. He splits Jumonville's head open with a tomahawk and washes his hands in the man's brain matter.
Oh my God. It's pure horror.
It is. And the result is dead, scalped Frenchmen in the woods, and a French diplomat murdered under Washington's watch.
And this single chaotic skirmish in the backwoods of America sets off a diplomatic nightmare.
It does. As the British politician Horace Walpole later noted, the volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire.
It was the spark that ignited the French and Indian War, which expanded into the 7 Years' War.
A massive global conflict involving Europe, India, and the Americas, all because of this kid in the woods.
And Washington's immediate reward for accidentally starting a world war is a terrifying, humiliating defeat.
Yeah, he knows the main French force is going to come hunting for him.
So he retreats to Great Meadows and frantically builds a defensive structure he literally calls Fort Necessity.
And it's a terrible position. It's built in a depression in the ground.
Right. And then the sky opens up. It starts pouring freezing rain.
Which is devastating for 18th century warfare.
Let's explain the mechanics of that for a second. They are using flintlock muskets.
Right.
You need dry gunpowder in the pan for the flint to strike a spark and ignite the main charge. If the powder is wet, the gun is just a heavy club.
Exactly. And the rain is filling the trenches. The gunpowder is completely ruined.
So on July 3rd, the French, who are led by Jumonville's half-brother, by the way, who was out for blood, they attack in massive numbers from the high ground in the tree line.
They just pour fire down into the muddy bowl of Fort Necessity. They kill or wound a third of Washington's men.
And on July 4th, 1754, Washington is forced into an unequivocal surrender.
It's his first major command, and it ends in absolute disaster. He signs the Articles of Capitulation in the pouring rain by candlelight.
And the document is in French, right? which he doesn't read.
Right. His translator does a poor job, and Washington unwittingly signs a document that explicitly confesses to the assassination of Jumonville.
Wow. It's a crushing humiliation. He's derided in London as a brash, reckless colonial who doesn't know the rules of civilized war.
He is. But this failure is essential to understanding the man. This humiliating defeat in the mud of Fort Necessity shaped his legendary caution later in life.
He learned the hard way the cost of aggressive, poorly planned action without proper logistics or terrain advantage.
Yes. But, paradoxically, the whole ordeal also made him famous throughout the colonies. He had stood up to the French.
And he quickly proves his sheer physical courage the very next year.
The Braddock Expedition in 1755.
Right. It's almost like a modern tech CEO whose startup dramatically bankrupts due to his own wild mismanagement. But because he looks so calm and articulate during the bankruptcy hearings, venture capitalists immediately give him more money for his next company.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Washington goes back out as an aide-de-camp to British General Edward Braddock. Braddock is bringing a massive professional British army to take Fort Duquesne.
And it's an absolute slaughter.
Why? What goes wrong?
Well, Braddock refuses to listen to Washington about how war is fought in the American woods. Braddock insists on marching in tight European columns.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the French and Native American fighters just ambush them from the tree line. Braddock is shot off his horse and mortally wounded. The British regulars panic and actually start shooting each other in the chaos.
Well, Washington. It's like witnessing a terrifying miracle.
He really is.
He rides back and forth across the battlefield trying to rally the men. He has two separate horses shot out from under him.
2 horses.
He is knocked to the dirt, gets on another horse, and keeps riding. And when the battle is over, he takes his coat off, and there are 4 separate bullet holes pierced through the fabric.
And he doesn't have a scratch on him.
He survives and helps organize the retreat, saving the remnants of the army. He's hailed as a hero locally and made commander of all Virginia forces.
So he spends the next 3 years defending 300 miles of rugged frontier against constant, brutal raids with only a few hundred starving militiamen.
Which had to be incredibly frustrating.
Oh, he's deeply frustrated. He's dealing with desertions, a total lack of supplies from the government, and political leaders who just won't support him.
But above all, he is desperately craving a regular royal commission in the British Army.
He wants to be a professional British soldier. He wants the red coat. He wants the pension. He wants the respect.
But he is repeatedly denied. They look down on him.
They do. To the British High Command, he is just a colonial, a
Yeah.
provincial amateur. It doesn't matter how many bullet holes are in his coat.
And that rejection stings deeply. The insecurity he felt about his lack of education flares up again.
He realizes there is a glass ceiling in the British Empire. And
Yeah.
because he was born in Virginia, he is never going to be allowed to break through it.
So, feeling entirely unappreciated, he quits.
Yeah.
He's hit a ceiling. The British establishment won't let him in. So if he can't win power and status on the battlefield, he's going to buy it, marry into it, and farm it. He resigns his commission in December 1758 and turns all that burning ambition homeward, which leads directly to his marriage in January 1759 to Martha Dandridge Custis.
And Martha changes everything. She is a 27-year-old widow, and she is incredibly wealthy.
Her first husband had left a massive estate, right?
Yes. Daniel Parke Custis. She is experienced in running a plantation, and she brings immediate, staggering, liquid wealth and property to the marriage.
They moved to Mount Vernon, which George has now fully inherited after Lawrence's widow passed away, and he takes a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses.
He has arrived.
Socially and financially, yes. His marriage gave him control over Martha's 1/3 dower interest in the massive Custis estate. We're talking 18,000 acres. And he managed the rest of it for her 2 young children, Jackie and Patsy.
Right.
But this immense wealth brings us to the grim paradox of Washington's life. We have to dive deeply into this because it frames everything that follows.
It does.
This is a man who will soon become obsessed with the concept of liberty, who will risk his life fighting against British tyranny while simultaneously holding hundreds of human beings in brutal intergenerational bondage.
It is the central contradiction of the American founding, embodied in one man.
And reading the detailed historical analyses, particularly the research on slavery and arson in colonial America, you see a side of Washington that is steeped in deep paranoia.
He was terrified of the very people he enslaved.
Because when you look at the mechanics of resistance for an enslaved person, organized armed rebellion was incredibly difficult and rare.
But fire. Fire was the ultimate equalizer. Arson destroys its own evidence. And the enslavers were acutely aware of this threat.
They were living in wooden houses, surrounded by highly flammable barns and crop storage, completely outnumbered by people who had every moral and human justification to hate them.
Right. The research highlights that Washington, despite his later historical reputation as a supposedly benevolent master, was plagued by fires on his properties and plagued by the anxiety they caused.
In 1781, he had a massive fire at Mount Vernon that destroyed a brick building.
He blamed it on a fraudulent and most wicked act, though he couldn't prove it. He constantly complained in his letters about enslaved servants carelessly running around with sparks of fire.
But the real tension comes a few years later. 2 more unexplained fires break out near the estate, and Washington's paranoia just peaks.
He immediately suspects an enslaved carpenter named Isaac.
Does he have proof?
No, he doesn't have solid proof. But in his letters, Washington grumbles that Isaac probably deserved a severe punishment anyway.
Wow. He's living in a house built by enslaved labor, sustained by enslaved labor, and he's terrified they're going to burn it all to the ground while he sleeps.
And that fear is compounded by a crushing economic reality.
Wait, really? Despite marrying into all that wealth, Washington is drowning in debt.
Yes. The British mercantile system was explicitly designed to keep colonials in a state of economic subservience. By 1764, he owes £1,800 to his London merchant, Robert Carey.
Let's explain how that mercantile trap actually worked, because it wasn't just bad budgeting on Washington's part.
Right. By law, Virginia planters had to sell their cash crops, primarily tobacco, to British merchants. They couldn't seek out better prices in France or Spain.
So it's a monopoly.
Exactly. The British merchants set the price for the tobacco, which was often artificially low. Then the planters used that credit to buy manufactured goods, tools, clothing, luxury items, fine wine from those same merchants.
And I bet the merchants inflated the prices of those goods.
Oh, absolutely. They charged high interest on the credit and hit the planters with exorbitant shipping and insurance fees.
There's a closed loop where the colonial is guaranteed to lose money year after year.
Precisely. Washington realizes he's on a hamster wheel, so what does he do? He pivots mechanically, he stops growing tobacco, which exhausts the soil anyway, and shifts to wheat.
He builds a massive grist mill to process the wheat into flour so he can sell a finished product. He starts a commercial fishing operation on the Potomac. He grows hemp.
He's diversifying his portfolio frantically just to get out from under the thumb of the British merchants.
And while he's fighting this intense economic stress, his physical health is a source of constant, excruciating agony.
Which brings us to one of the biggest myths in American history. We need to completely debunk the wooden teeth story.
Yes. George Washington did not have wooden teeth.
He didn't. Wood would have rotted in a matter of months in a human mouth.
Ugh, gross.
He suffered from severe tooth decay starting in his 20s. It was likely exacerbated by the calomel, the mercury chloride he was given to treat various illnesses like smallpox and malaria.
Because mercury destroys tooth enamel.
Right, so he had teeth pulled regularly throughout his life until he eventually lost all of them except one.
And the dentures he wore were horrifying contraptions. They were made of a lead or gold base, carved hippopotamus or walrus ivory, and actual human teeth.
Yeah, and they were held together by stiff wire springs that forced his mouth open.
Meaning he had to consciously clench his jaw shut at all times just to keep them in his mouth. That's why his jaw looks so unnaturally rigid in the famous portraits.
And it gets darker.
How so?
The ledger books from Mount Vernon show that Washington purchased human teeth from unidentified people, and historians note it was a common practice for impoverished people or enslaved people who had no choice to have their teeth extracted and sold to dentists.
Wow. And the pain Washington was in daily was blinding. He was constantly self-medicating with laudanum, an opiate, just to function.
Right.
So let's look at the psychology of the man at this moment. He is in constant radiating physical pain. He is drowning in debt to a British system he feels is rigging the game against him. He is living in deep fear of the people he keeps in bondage.
It's a powder keg.
It's his underlying boiling anxiety what pushed him toward revolution.
This raises an important question about cause and effect. The intersection of his personal anxieties and his political radicalization is undeniable.
Throughout the 1760s and early 1770s, the British Parliament starts piling on direct taxes. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Coercive Acts.
Washington doesn't just see this as bad tax policy, he feels it as a personal insult. He feels the British are invading their fundamental rights as Englishmen.
He writes that the British are trying to reduce the colonists to the status of tame and abject slaves.
The irony of that statement from a massive slaveholder is glaring to us today. But to him, the threat of economic and political subjugation was visceral.
This personal sense of being stifled and disrespected, which really started back when they denied him a Royal Military Commission in his 20s, it boils over into full-blown political rebellion.
By May 1775, blood has been spilled. The shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord has happened. The colonies are in crisis.
Washington shows up to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia,
Yeah.
and he is not wearing a modest gentleman's suit.
No, he is wearing his full buff and blue military uniform from his time commanding the independent Fairfax County Militia.
He is the only man in the room in uniform. He doesn't give speeches demanding command, but his attire sends a massive, undeniable signal. I am ready to fight.
And it works. Congress unanimously selects him to lead the newly formed Continental Army.
John Adams is the one who formally nominated him, right?
Yes, and Adams wasn't just impressed by the uniform, it was a political masterstroke. The rebellion at that point was mostly a New England affair, Massachusetts guys fighting outside Boston.
Adams knew that if they didn't get the wealthy, populous southern colonies invested, the British would crush them.
Exactly. Choosing a Virginian to lead a New England army bound the continent together.
Washington accepts. He takes command on June 19, 1775, and he makes a very shrewd public relations move. He refuses a salary.
Right, he asks only that Congress cover his expenses, keeping his own accounts. It reinforces this image of Republican virtue, of a gentleman serving his country out of pure duty.
But the situation he walks into is terrifying. He travels up to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and takes charge of what is essentially an armed mob.
It's a ragtag, undisciplined, starving militia besieging the British trapped in Boston. The men are sleeping in huts made of sailcloth and turf.
They elect their own officers and basically ignore orders.
They literally don't have enough gunpowder to fight a battle. Washington is horrified.
So he initiates brutal drills, he institutes the lash for insubordination, and he systematically removes incompetent elected officers, replacing them with men he trusts.
And against all odds, he manages an early, massive victory. In the winter of 1775 to 1776, he sends a bookseller-turned-artillery commander named Henry Knox on a seemingly impossible mission.
The logistics of this are mind-blowing. Knox goes to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, which Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had captured.
Right.
Knox loads 59 massive iron and brass cannons onto wooden sleds. And in the dead of winter, using teams of oxen, he drags 120,000 pounds of artillery 300 miles across frozen rivers over the Berkshire Mountains, all the way to Boston.
And Washington uses them brilliantly. Overnight, in March 1776, he moves these cannons to Dorchester Heights, a series of hills overlooking Boston Harbor.
Mechanically, this changes everything. Explain why that specific placement forced the British out.
It's all about naval vulnerability. The British power was their navy. Their ships were in the harbor protecting the city. But wooden ships are incredibly vulnerable to plunging fire.
Meaning cannonballs shot from a high elevation down through the thin wooden decks of a ship.
Exactly. By placing the cannons on Dorchester Heights, Washington essentially pointed a loaded gun at the head of the British fleet.
The British commander, General William Howe, wakes up, sees the cannons, and realizes he has to evacuate immediately or lose his entire navy.
The British sail away. It's a bloodless strategic triumph.
But the euphoria doesn't last, because then New York happens.
Yes, the British Empire strikes back with overwhelming force. General Howe and his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, arrive in New York Harbor in the summer of 1776 with a massive armada.
Over 400 ships and 32,000 professional British and Hessian soldiers. Washington's army is heavily outnumbered and completely outclassed.
And Washington makes terrible tactical mistakes. At the Battle of Long Island in August 1776, he splits his forces, leaves his flanks unguarded, and is soundly beaten.
He is forced into a humiliating, desperate retreat across New York and New Jersey throughout the fall. He loses Fort Washington, losing 3,000 men and vital supplies.
His men are deserting by the thousands. Enlistments are set to expire at the end of the year. Morale is in the absolute gutter.
This is when Thomas Paine famously writes his pamphlet, The American Crisis, starting with the words, "These are the times that try men's souls."
Washington's army shrinks to a few thousand exhausted, freezing men. He's being chased across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania.
So we have to pause here and ask the critical question.
Yeah.
Was Washington actually a great general? Or was he just a great survivor who got lucky and knew how to avoid total destruction?
That's a fair question.
Because looking at his record, he wasn't traditionally trained in the art of war. He lost far more battles than he won. He made glaring tactical errors that cost thousands of lives.
That is the debate historians have had for 2 centuries. But the modern strategic analysis completely reframes Washington.
How so?
If you judge him purely as a European-style battlefield tactician, a man moving blocks of infantry on a map, he was mediocre. But he wasn't trying to be Frederick the Great. He was America's first true national security strategist.
Which means looking beyond the battlefield. Modern military thinkers talk about the instruments of national power. But let's actually look at how he manipulated the whole board.
Right.
Let's talk about the intelligence war, because his use of espionage is wild.
He was a spy master. He quickly realized he couldn't beat the British in a straight fight, so he had to outsmart them. He authorized the creation of the Culper spy ring.
Operating right under the noses of the British military occupation in New York City.
And the mechanics of this ring are fascinating. It wasn't just guys listening at tavern doors. They used strict compartmentalization.
Meaning agents didn't know the identities of other agents. So if one was captured, the whole ring wouldn't fall.
Precisely. They used complex numerical ciphers. They used invisible ink, a chemical compound developed by James J. that only appeared when brushed with a specific reagent.
They had a system where a woman named Anna Strong would hang her laundry in a specific pattern on the clothesline on Long Island to signal to whaleboat captains where the dead drops of intelligence were hidden in the coves.
And Washington directed this personally. He fed the British false intelligence constantly.
He would have his aides draft fake reports exaggerating the size of his army and then ensure those documents fell into the hands of known British spies.
Before the Battle of Princeton, he left a skeleton crew to keep campfires burning brightly, making a massive racket with pickaxes.
Convincing the British he was entrenched while he silently slipped his entire main army around their flank in the dark.
But all the intelligence in the world doesn't matter if you can't pay your troops, and the economic situation was catastrophic.
The Continental Congress was printing paper money, continental currency, to pay for the war, but it wasn't backed by gold or silver.
No, it was backed by the promise of future tax revenue from an independent nation that didn't technically exist yet.
So the value of the currency fluctuated wildly based on Washington's success on the battlefield. If he lost, the money became worthless.
Inflation was rampant. Washington had to become an economic manager, constantly begging Congress for hard currency, requisitioning supplies from locals, and issuing IOUs.
And when American money completely failed, he had to rely on his diplomatic skills to secure foreign funds.
Yeah.
He heavily leveraged the alliance with France.
The entire decisive Yorktown campaign in 1781 was funded by Spanish silver that the French brought over from Havana, Cuba.
Because the American treasury was literally empty.
Which highlights his brilliance in alliance management. He wasn't a formal diplomat sitting in Paris like Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, but Washington was the one on the ground managing the massive, fragile egos of French military commanders.
Men like Admiral d'Estaing and General Rochambeau.
These were professional European aristocrats. They could have easily looked at Washington, a self-taught colonial, and refused to follow his lead.
But Washington navigated that relationship perfectly. He showed them intense respect. He compromised on strategy, and he kept the alliance intact through several miserable years of military setbacks.
But let's go back to the darkest moment before the French arrived, December 1776.
The British have chased him across the Delaware River. The Continental Congress is so terrified they have fled Philadelphia.
Washington writes a private letter to his brother confessing that the game is pretty nearly up.
He has maybe 7,600 men on paper, but only a fraction are physically fit for duty. The river is freezing. The enlistments expire in a week. He knows that if he doesn't do something audacious, the army will dissolve, people will go home, and the revolution is dead.
So he plans the crossing of the Delaware. It's a highly complex, three-pronged night raid on an isolated garrison of Hessian mercenaries at Trenton, New Jersey.
And the password for the operation is exactly what you'd expect from a desperate man: victory or death.
That is the absolute stakes. On Christmas night, a massive nor'easter hits. It's a freezing storm of rain, sleet, and snow.
Washington loads his men onto shallow draft Durham boats. The river is choked with massive blocks of ice. It's so treacherous that 2 of his 3 forces failed to cross the river entirely.
It is a logistical nightmare. But Washington pushes through. He lands on the New Jersey side with about 2,400 men and a few cannons.
They are hours behind schedule. It's pitch black. and they have to march 9 miles to Trenton in a blizzard.
You read the diaries of the men who survived this. The physical misery is unimaginable. The men don't have winter coats. Many don't even have shoes.
They have wrapped their feet in rags. As they march, the ice cuts their feet, and they are literally leaving a trail of bloody footprints in the pristine snow.
Their muskets are getting wet, just like at Fort Necessity, and Washington realizes they might not be able to fire.
He rides up and down the line and tells them, "Use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton."
They attack at dawn. The Hessians, commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, are caught completely off guard.
Washington's artillery commands the streets. The battle is brief and violent. They capture nearly 900 Hessian mercenaries, and the American casualties, practically zero.
5 men were wounded or killed, including a young officer named James Monroe, the future president, who was nearly killed while heroically capturing the Hessian artillery pieces.
It's an incredible tactical victory, but its strategic impact was immeasurable. It shocks the British High Command. It proved the Americans could actually fight. It saved the Continental Army from disintegrating, and it completely revived the morale of the American public.
And he followed it up days later with another brilliant flanking victory at Princeton.
So to return to your earlier question, was he a great general or a survivor?
Survival was his strategy. He understood something the British took years to figure out.
What's that?
The British thought they needed to capture cities: New York, Philadelphia, Charleston. Washington realized that the geography of America was too vast.
The British could capture every city, but as long as the Continental Army existed in the field, the British could not win the war.
Exactly. Washington was the revolution.
He kept that fragile army alive through the horrors of the Valley Forge winter in 1777-1778, where disease and starvation killed thousands.
And he used that winter not just to survive, but to rebuild. He brought in Baron von Steuben, a Prussian drill master, to teach the men standardized European drills.
How to march in sync, how to use the bayonet effectively. He forged a professional army out of starting volunteers.
He kept that flame alive for years until the global geopolitical landscape shifted. The French entered the war, bringing their navy and professional troops.
And finally, in 1781, Washington executes his masterpiece.
He uses that elaborate deception network we talked about to convince the British commander in New York, Henry Clinton, that a massive attack on Manhattan is imminent.
Clinton huddles his forces in New York, waiting. Meanwhile, Washington force marches his French and American army 400 miles south to Virginia.
The Siege of Yorktown. He traps a completely different British army, commanded by Lord Cornwallis, against the sea.
The French Navy arrives just in time to block the British rescue fleet. Cornwallis is surrounded, pounded by artillery day and night, and is forced to surrender his entire army.
It effectively breaks the political will of the British Parliament to continue the war.
The war is won, but Washington's most brilliant, world-changing maneuver wasn't a battle at all. It was what he chose to do when the fighting stopped.
December 1783. The Treaty of Paris is signed. Britain officially recognizes American independence. The British troops evacuate New York.
George Washington is the supreme military commander of a victorious army. He is universally beloved. He is the most powerful man on the continent.
In almost any other historical context, in any other country, this is the exact moment the victorious general marches his loyal army on the capital, purges the politicians who failed to supply him for 8 years, and crowns himself king, or at least military dictator.
Caesar did it. Cromwell did it. Napoleon would do it a few years later.
But Washington does the opposite.
He goes to Fraunces Tavern in New York, tearfully says goodbye to his loyal officers, and then rides to Annapolis, Maryland, where the Continental Congress is meeting.
He walks into the chamber, pulls the spectacles from his pocket, and in a shaky voice, he officially resigns his military commission.
He voluntarily surrenders all power and rides home to Mount Vernon to be a farmer.
The world was utterly stunned. It was completely counter to human nature.
King George III supposedly asked his American painter, Benjamin West, what Washington would do after the war. West said he would return to his farm. And the king replied, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world."
It's an unprecedented act of Republican virtue. He becomes the modern Cincinnatus, the Roman general, who saved the Republic and then gave up his dictatorial powers to return to his plow.
But his retirement at Mount Vernon doesn't last. The new nation under the Articles of Confederation is rapidly failing.
The federal government has no power to tax, it has no executive branch, it has no standing army. The states are fighting with each other. The economy is in a depression.
And then, in 1786, Shays' Rebellion happens in Massachusetts, armed farmers rising up against debt collection. It terrifies the American elite.
They realize the country is sliding into anarchy. So in 1787, they call the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia to draft a new system of government.
And they know, absolutely, that the new document will completely lack legitimacy unless George Washington's name is on it.
He is deeply, deeply reluctant to go. He's trying to fix his farms. He's drowning in expenses because Mount Vernon has essentially become a hotel for veterans, politicians, and European admirers who want to meet the great man.
He is physically exhausted.
Completely.
It's like a retired CEO who saved the company from bankruptcy, went off to a private island, and now the board is begging him to come back and manage a massive, hostile restructuring. He knows that if he fails this time, his entire legacy, everything he suffered for in the war, is ruined.
If we look at the correspondence from that time, you have to read the letter from Gouverneur Morris in the National Archives source.
Morris is pleading with Washington to accept the presidency once the Constitution is drafted.
Morris uses this incredible metaphor. He writes, "Among these 13 horses now about to be coupled together, there are some of every race and character. They will listen to your voice and submit to your control. You therefore must mount this seat."
He knows he has to do it. He attends the convention in 1787. He sits as the silent presiding officer. He barely speaks during the debates.
But his presence is everything. And the entire time the delegates are drafting Article 2, the executive branch, the presidency, everyone in the room knows they're designing a suit for Washington to wear.
They give the president immense powers, veto power, command of the military powers they would never have entrusted to anyone else because they trusted Washington not to abuse them.
The Constitution is ratified. The Electoral College unanimously elects him, the only time in history that has happened.
And in April 1789, he heads to New York City to be inaugurated as the first president of the United States.
And his presidency sounds absolutely exhausting. Every single thing he does sets a precedent that will last for centuries.
He is walking an impossible tightrope. He has to project enough dignity and authority so that hostile foreign powers, Britain, France, Spain, respect the United States. But he can't look or act like a monarch, or the American people will revolt.
The debate over his title perfectly illustrates this anxiety. The Senate, led by John Adams, wants a grand European-style title.
They propose calling him His Highness, the President of the United States of America, and protector of their liberties.
Washington recognizes immediately how dangerous that sounds. He shuts it down. He chooses the incredibly simple democratic title, Mr. President.
He has to build the government from scratch. He establishes the first cabinet, and he surrounds himself with the most brilliant minds available, even if they hate each other.
He appoints Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury.
And almost immediately, these two massive egos start tearing each other and the cabinet apart.
It is the birth of the two-party system, which Washington despised. Hamilton envisions a strong central government, a national bank, a standing army, and an industrial, mercantile economy aligned with Britain.
Jefferson envisions a decentralized republic of independent farmers, state power, and an alliance with revolutionary France. They are fighting for the very soul of the nation.
Washington generally sides with Hamilton's financial vision, understanding that without secure national credit, the country will collapse. He signs the bill, creating the first bank of the United States.
But doing so deeply alienates Jefferson and his followers.
Amidst all this vicious political infighting, Washington still manages to articulate the highest ideals of the new nation. In 1790, he visits Rhode Island and writes a letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport.
The language in this letter is breathtaking. It's a cornerstone document of religious freedom. He promises that the United States government will give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance.
He explicitly pledges that religious minorities will be safe, invoking beautiful biblical imagery, saying that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and none shall make them afraid.
It is a soaring defense of human rights. Yet at the exact same time, he is presiding over a government that is aggressively and violently expanding into Native American territories in the Northwest, culminating in the bloody Battle of Fallen Timbers.
He is personally riding out in 1794 at the head of a 12,000-man militia to crush the Whiskey Rebellion American farmers in Pennsylvania who were violently protesting a federal excise tax drafted by Hamilton.
He is navigating the incredibly dangerous geopolitical waters of the French Revolution, issuing a proclamation of neutrality while Britain and France go to war, which infuriates the Jeffersonians who want to support France. He is under constant, immense pressure.
Very much so.
Did he ever just want to walk away, throw his hands up and say, I did my part, I'm done?
Desperately. He desperately wanted to retire after his first term in 1792. But both Jefferson and Hamilton, who agreed on almost nothing else in the world, went to him and begged him to stay.
They essentially told him that the Union would fracture into civil war without his unifying presence. So he reluctantly agrees to a second term.
But by 1796, the partisan warfare is so toxic, the press is attacking him viciously, calling him a tyrant, a hypocrite, suggesting he wants to be king, and he finally says, enough, I am done.
He refuses to run for a third term, establishing the two-term precedent that lasted until FDR.
And he tasks Alexander Hamilton with helping him draft his final warning to the country, the farewell address, published in September 1796 in the newspapers. It's not a speech, it's an essay, and it's a heavy prophetic document.
He warns the nation against the spirit of party hyper-partisanship that he saw tearing the country apart. He warns against permanent foreign alliances that would drag America into European wars.
He warns against geographic sectionalism, the North dividing against the South. It is his final piece of strategic advice to the nation he built.
He steps down, attends John Adams' inauguration as a private citizen, and finally goes back to the dirt of Mount Vernon.
Which brings us to the final somber chapter of his life. He has about 2.5 years of retirement. He's trying to get his chaotic finances in order.
He builds one of the largest whiskey distilleries in America at Mount Vernon to try and generate cash. He spends months secretly writing his will. And then we reach Thursday, December 12, 1799.
The 67-year-old Washington rides out on horseback to inspect his farms. The weather is awful. It's a mixture of freezing rain, sleet, and snow.
He's in the saddle for 5 hours, exposed to the elements. He comes home late for dinner, always punctual. He sits down to eat without changing his wet, icy clothes.
The next day, he has a severe sore throat. But he refuses to take it easy. He goes out again in the snow to mark some trees for cutting.
By the very early morning hours of Saturday the 14th, he wakes up struggling to breathe. And this brings us back to the horrifying medical treatment we described at the very beginning of our deep dive.
Right. He develops what modern epidemiologists and doctors believe was severe epiglottitis, a massive acute bacterial infection and swelling of the epiglottis, the flap at the base of the tongue that covers the windpipe.
As we discussed, it acts like a one-way valve trapping air out. His doctors, including his lifelong friend James Craik, arrive.
But 18th century medicine was largely based on humoral theory, the idea that illness was caused by an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors, particularly an excess of blood causing inflammation.
So, they bleed him, repeatedly. They use a lancet to open a vein in his arm. Over the course of the day, they drain an estimated 5 pints of blood.
The human body only holds about 9 to 10 pints.
Mechanically, they are inducing severe hypovolemic shock. His heart is racing, trying to pump oxygenated blood that simply isn't there to lungs that physically cannot pull in air because the windpipe is swollen shut.
They also give him doses of calomel, a toxic mercury-based purgative, to induce vomiting and diarrhea, dehydrating him even further.
They blister his throat with cantharides, a toxic preparation of crushed beetles, hoping to draw the inflammation out through the skin.
One younger doctor who arrives, Elisha Dick, suggests a radical new procedure, a tracheotomy, cutting a hole directly into the trachea below the swelling so Washington could breathe.
But the older doctors overrule him because it was a dangerous, largely untested procedure, and they were terrified of being the men who accidentally slit George Washington's throat.
Washington, always the realist, recognizes that the treatments are killing him and that his body is failing. He asks the doctors to stop torturing him.
He asks his wife Martha to bring him his 2 wills from his desk, and he burns the old one. He tells his secretary, Tobias Lear, to make sure he isn't put in the vault for at least 3 days after he dies.
He had a profound, lifelong terror of being buried alive, which was a real risk in an era before modern stethoscopes.
And then, between 10 and 11 p.m. on December 14th, lying in his bed, struggling for his final breaths, he feels his own pulse. With Martha sitting at the foot of his bed, he says his final words. "'Tis well," and he dies.
The man who survived the freezing mud of Fort Necessity, the bullet storm of Braddock's defeat, the icy nightmare of the Delaware crossing, and the crushing stress of the presidency, is finally killed by a throat infection and overzealous doctors.
But his death activates his will.
Mm.
And we have to talk about what was in that document, because it is the ultimate tragic coda to his life.
Written in secret as he faced his mortality, Washington ordered the emancipation of the enslaved people he owned.
He was the only major founding father from a slaveholding state to free his slaves. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, none of them did it.
But Washington's emancipation was a delayed, highly complex justice. He stipulated that his slaves be freed only upon Martha's death, largely to avoid the emotional agony of tearing families apart while she was still alive.
But let's explain the legal mechanics of why it was such a tragedy. He couldn't free all the enslaved people at Mount Vernon.
No, he couldn't, because of 18th century Virginian inheritance laws, specifically dower laws. Over half the enslaved people at Mount Vernon didn't legally belong to George.
They were dower slaves, belonging to the Custis estate, Martha's first husband's family. They were held in trust for Martha's grandchildren.
George legally could not free them, sell them, or take them out of the state. And over 40 years of marriage, his enslaved people had intermarried with the Custis dower slaves. They had formed deep, complex family networks.
So Washington sets a ticking time bomb. The moment Martha dies, half the enslaved population of Mount Vernon will be free, and the other half will remain enslaved, property of the Custis heirs.
Martha realizes this. She realizes she is suddenly surrounded by enslaved people whose freedom literally depends on her dying. She is terrified.
So she signs a deed of manumission freeing George's slaves early on January 1st, 1801, a year after his death.
And the tragic result is precisely what Washington feared. Families are torn apart. Free husbands have to leave Mount Vernon while their enslaved wives and children are kept in bondage by the Custis estate and eventually scattered across the South.
It is a heavy, deeply unresolved legacy. He built a nation based on liberty, but his own estate remained a site of profound human tragedy.
4 days after his death, they hold a private military funeral at Mount Vernon. A small cavalry unit, some infantry, clergymen, and a riderless horse, fully saddled with his boots placed backward in the stirrups, an ancient sign of a fallen warrior, follow his coffin to the Brick family vault on the estate.
Congress later begged for his body to be entombed in the U.S. Capitol, in a crypt beneath the rotunda, but his family refused. He stayed in the dirt of Virginia.
A fitting end for the man.
To summarize this immense, heavy journey, George Washington wasn't a god carved in marble. He was an anxious, fiercely ambitious, flawed, and profoundly disciplined man. He was scarred by smallpox, haunted his whole life by his lack of formal education, in constant physical agony from his teeth, and deeply paranoid about slave rebellions.
Yet he held together an impossible political and military experiment through sheer force of will, an incredibly brilliant grasp of strategic power, and a commitment to Republican ideals that suppressed his own ego when it mattered most.
I want you, the listener, to consider how the precedents he set, the peaceful transfer of power, the rejection of a royal crown, the structure of the presidency itself still shape the very ground you walk on today. The fact that the military answers to civilian authority, the fact that a president serves their term and goes home.
It's easy to take those things for granted now.
But I want to leave you with one final, lingering, provocative thought. Early in our discussion, we explored how Washington likely became sterile from his bout with smallpox in Barbados as a teenager. He never had biological children.
Right.
What if he had? In an era that was entirely accustomed to kings, queens, and royal bloodlines, an era where powerful men like Alexander Hamilton were actively pushing for an incredibly strong, almost monarchical executive, would the temptation to establish a Washington dynasty have overpowered his Republican virtue?
That's a fascinating question.
If he had a biological son, would the American people, who loved Washington with an almost religious fervor, have demanded that his son be the second president? Would we have traded King George III of England for King George I of America?
It's highly possible.
Did a tragic, scarring illness in his youth actually save the American Republic from becoming a monarchy? Think about that the next time you look at a perfectly smooth marble statue.